Okay. Hello, everyone. It's really a delight to see so many of you online. So firstly, a welcome to our Storrington and Arran Valley regional group of the Sussex Wildlife Trust members, and also those of the Eastbourne regional group who have joined us tonight. I know there are some of our neighbours and friends have come along, but many of the names were not familiar to us. So what I'd like to say is, whoever you are, however you've come to hear about this particular event, a very warm welcome to you on this pretty cold night, really, isn't it? So for those who don't know us, I am Viviane Ducy, and I'm the chair of the regional group of the Sussex Wildlife Trust. We are a group active around the Storrington and Arran Valley to further the aims of the Sussex Wildlife Trust locally. Our guest speaker tonight is Sarah Abercromby. She's a close neighbour and a friend in Storrington, and in fact our group's Wildflower Meadow champion. Julie Gamelin is on the committee as our garden project coordinator. After Sarah's presentation, Julie will say a few words on the benefits of wildflower meadows to wildlife. There will be time for comments and discussions, as we've said, and Julie will start by running through the questions from the chat. We will draw in Tony Whitbread into the discussion, and many of you will know Tony as an ecologist and also president of the Sussex Wildlife Trust. So that's us. Let me kickstart tonight's proceedings really with a rather shocking statistic. Just throw ourselves straight in. We've lost 97% of our wildflower meadows since the Second World War. That's 97%. And the main reason is the change in management of our agricultural farmlands. This is through ploughing up the fields, reseeding with coarse grassland, and then adding in extra fertilizers and chemicals to increase food production post-war. So I guess one can say that it's through human activity that we have degraded our soils and this habitat. But surely then also it is through human endeavor that we can rebuild those systems, recover what is lost, and regenerate the ecosystem. At this point, I just want to mention that there are two very distinct ecological systems at work here, and each of these are sustained through a different management regime. The one is cornfield annuals, and the other one is wildflower meadows. Many people get these confused, and as a result, it can lead to despondency and contribute to the failure of establishing a true long-term wildflower meadow, or otherwise it's known as a flower-rich hay meadow. So just a reminder of these two systems, cornfield annuals are the weeds that used to grow underneath or between arable crops. They are found in areas which are disturbed on an annual basis for food production. The plants are opportunistic, fast-growing on bare soil, and they spring up in a multitude of colors, giving a burst to insects that aid crop pollination. So these are annual plants that obviously live only for 1 year and include the examples like cornflower, corncrake, corncockle, and corn marigold. In contrast, what we are talking about tonight is a wildflower meadow. This is a leftover of a grazed agricultural system that establishes itself over a number of years as a perennial flower-rich meadow. More recently, the associated farming practices have gone out of use. But if we reinstate a wildflower meadow where once there was one, we will resurrect some of the seeds already present in the soil, and the plants can be allowed to flourish as a result of how we manage that parcel of land. Just to give you an idea, to compare a wildflower meadow with an agriculturally improved pasture, you may get 5 plant species in the pasture, whereas an established wildflower meadow may yield something like 150 species. So that's a huge difference. The resultant effect is that also you will create and attract the whole host of insects and other creatures to these wildflower meadows. And Julie will touch on this briefly a bit later on. We can all take inspiration from people like Sarah, who will be telling us her story of how she came to create her own wildflower meadow. Sarah and her family live just up the road from us, and so we've known them for some years. When an opportunity came up for acquiring an extra bit of pasture, Sarah contacted us to get some advice on what to do or how best to manage the field. Besides planting some trees, which is obvious in selected areas, one of the suggestions Tony came with was to return this overgrazed and degraded grassland into a flower-rich meadow. And guess what? To our delight, that's exactly what Sarah did. She contacted friends of ours, Jane and Michael Joseph, who run the Wildflower Meadow courses for the Sussex Wildlife Trust. And here tonight is Sarah to share with us her story of the Wildflower Meadow creation. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Viv. Okay, I'll try and share screen. First of all, I hope I didn't disappoint this evening, because I have to admit I'm no expert. I'm not an ecologist, I'm not a botanist. I could possibly say I'm an expert in shifting turf and growing weeds, and not a lot else, but I'm an enthusiast. And by selling this meadow, I'm totally transformed how I approach a rough patch of grass or a ground that just like a weedy area. I now go, oh, how lovely, as opposed to, oh God, somebody needs to clear that up. I also just need to correct Viv just very subtly. Yes, I did contact Viv and Tony about what to do with this ground. I came across a very, very over-enthusiastic friend of theirs, Michael Joseph, who basically told me in no uncertain terms, I needed a flower meadow. Now, I'm not sure I believed him at the time. I agreed with him, and the results were fantastic. And I'm also very glad to hear, unfortunately, they're not here tonight, but I'm very glad to tell you all we are very good friends, and we're very happy with the outcome. Okay, so basically this is just a series of pictures just to show what we've achieved and how we did it. So here it goes. So this was our starting point. We acquired a couple of acres of land surrounding our house. This is a really, really windy area. We're on the side of a hill, we overlook the downs, and we get all the gales. It's pretty sandy most of the time, and it was heavily compacted. It was grazed with horses. And when I say horses, 30 or 40 horses were on 15 acres all year round, so heavily grazed. When this photograph was taken, we already had the land fenced for, oh, that looks like May time, so for about 5 months, and that had been empty that time. So you can see how little grass has actually grown back. So this is how badly the soil had been trashed. I had already started to dig out the ragwort, the thistles. I'm afraid I'm a veterinary surgeon, and the veterinary surgeon in me won't let ragwort grow when I've got horses and livestock. I know that will upset some of the ecologists, but I'm sorry, a leopard can't change all its spots at once, I'm afraid. So Michael Joseph offered us his flower meadow seed, and he was planning to cut his meadow when it's gone to seed at the beginning of August. So this is July 2019. Again, this was on his advice, was we were to clear the turf. So for this, we used a turf cutter. Now, the rationale behind clearing the turf is that the roots of the agricultural grasses, they form like a really thick mat. It literally is, it's several inches thick, and it's really heavy. It's extremely dense, and if you try and just dig a little bit of hole and put seeds in, most people won't succeed. Some people describe using a deep harrow instead, and I've certainly seen that on the Slindon estate, the National Trust Slindon estate, a big harrow being used. But this is what we did. So then we had to roll up this turf. I also had to add, we did this in 35-degree heat because we didn't have very long to do it. We suddenly realized we had to get it prepared and ready. So this is what we did. It was hard work. My husband is in the white hat and blue shirt. We hired a turf cutter, which was really not up to the job. This is a dear neighbour who was trying to add a little bit of weight and give us a little bit of extra help, but I'm not sure it worked. This is us trying to shift this turf. Stupidly, we cleared about 3/4 of an acre. Now, if you do it again, start with a small patch because this was hard work. And as you can see from the rolls of turf, there was a vast amount of turf came off here. None of this turf went to waste. We used it to fill holes in our lawn. We used it to make various banks, but I also made a big heap of turf, which a couple of years later it rotted down nicely and provided a beautiful fine topsoil for my new veg patch. So nothing was wasted except an awful lot of energy and sweat. Okay, I'm just going to jump forward a little bit. When we've actually done sowed meadow several years in a row, and in the second year we were videoed by Richard Vobes, who calls himself the Bald Explorer. So I'm going to show uses some of his photos on his YouTube site. It is worth having a look at it. It's really quite interesting. He did a series of 3 short videos of harvesting Jane and Michael's flower meadow. So do go and have a look at it, and this is why I've mentioned the Bald Explorer. So this is Michael cutting his meadow. So you can see that we could just about see a few flowers left, but most of all the flowers have gone to seed. This was in early August. It had to be a really dry day because it's really important that the hay and seed didn't start to rot. Okay, he's using a mechanical size, so it's literally there's the hay and the flowers, and it's cutting off the stalks at the bottom so it doesn't damage the seed heads. And it's an awful lot quicker than doing it by hand. If you used a lawnmower type thing, it would crush up all the vegetation and probably damage the seed heads, and you'd lose a lot of the seed in the process. So you're trying to not disturb the seed heads and just cut it from the bottom. Then we had to rake up all this hay, and this year's patch I think is about half an acre. Am I right? And this was quite a lot of hard work. It's much more than you think it's going to be. And so the whole family was joined in with this. So we filled up a trailer. We actually had 2 trailer loads. Again, this is very useful to have young muscles. This is actually my son offloading the hay at the other end. So literally all he did was we just spread the hay on the bare soil. Okay, and the important thing is that it's actually some you've got to be very, very careful with the timing. You don't want this hay to start rotting. So it was literally loaded up straight onto, driven to our meadow, and then unloaded within a matter of hours. While we actually did this, the hay smelled beautiful. The neighbouring horses were all hanging over the fence trying to eat it because it smelled fantastic. So this is us spreading it, and it doesn't look like anything, does it? I mean, that's what we've got. Quite just a load of hay on the grass, on the floor. But a few months later, we actually did see some signs of germination. Now, I know Viv has just talked to you about cornfield annuals being something totally quite different from a well-established flower meadow. However, this is what we did in our first year, and being a bit naive, we just liked the pretty flowers of the cornfield annuals. So I bought some cornfield annual seed. Now, in the Joseph's established flower meadow, there wouldn't have been any cornfield annuals because they've only got perennials. So none of these seeds would have been available in his flower meadow. So they've got corn cockle, that's the purple, cornflowers, it's blue flowers. Sorry, I don't know if I do. Oh, does that work? Can you see a pointer? No. There's some chamomile, called marigolds, which I think you can see here. It was very, very pretty. It's if you want a really good feel good, just with a bit of colour photographs, this is lovely. But it is only an annual, so it's really going to be only like this in the first year. I bought the seed from Emmersgate Seeds, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. Okay. I also bought some yellow rattle seed. Now, there was a yellow rattle seed available in the meadow from the Joses, but he did recommend I bought some more. The idea about using yellow rattle is it's supposed to help reduce the amount of grass in the aggressive grasses in the meadow. It supposedly reduces or parasitizes the roots of the grass. It does actually reduce the growth of other plants as well, not just grass, but we're using it for that effect. I'm not sure everybody is in agreement whether this is the right thing to do. I have heard a few people think this is a bit unnecessary. We did it, and I have lots of yellow rattle, and I give out lots of yellow rattle seed to people. So I don't know, it's what we've done. If you're planting yellow rattle, the important thing is the seeds need prolonged chilling. So if you sow it, you want to sow it in the autumn, and ideally you want a cold winter for it to overwinter, and then it'll germinate in spring. There's no point in trying to sow it in the spring. Okay, and it's this pretty yellow flower, flowers May to September. Ours really only just flowered sort of May and June is main flowering time. Okay, as I mentioned, we bought extra seed from Emmersgate, and again that was recommended by the Josephs. And you can see that then Prince of Wales uses this site. Wildflower seed is incredibly expensive to buy from reputable companies. Another company here is Naturescape, recommended by Martin Callagher. Now, when I say incredibly expensive, a few hundred grams is several £100 if you're not careful. It's a lot of money. It goes a long way, but I think if you're going to use the seed, you really need to think about where you're going to sow it, what are you going to plant, what are you trying to achieve before you go and buy it. Emmersgate Seeds, the people were fantastic. I asked them sent them lots of questions. They gave me lots of answers. So I think it's something, if you're not an expert, do ask questions first before you buy. I'd also be very wary about buying these cheap packets of seeds that you see in some of the garden centres and online, because you really want to guarantee it's UK seed. You don't want to introduce diseases we don't want to introduce. But this is an expensive way of doing it. And I'm jolly glad we only use additional seed from these companies rather than do it from scratch. We wouldn't have been able to afford to do this. Okay, so this is a few months later. We didn't actually clear the hay from the ground. I think if it'd been very thick, I probably would have done. So there's a bit of rotting hay, and you can see some of the weeds, as my mother would have called it, weeds growing through. There's bits of grass growing through, and the picture on the right, I think, is probably taken October time in the first year. Okay. Being a bit anal, I did keep digging out the creeping thistle. I did dig out the patches of ragwort. As I told you, I'm a vet. I don't like ragwort. I'm sorry. Okay. So it looks like a weed patch. Now, in the first year this appeared, we were very lucky. This was during the first lockdown, 2020. We had a selection of perennials, so mainly oxeye daisies. And I know this could be a problem that we end up with a monoculture of oxeye daisies, but most of it's oxeye daisies. We have a lot of clover, red clover, white clover. The common cat's ear, which looks a bit like a dandelion, for those who don't know, it's a yellow flower. Common fleabane, the knapweeds, which are the beautiful purple thistle-like flowers. Common mouse ear, little white flowers. Hawksbeard and borealis, and those are just a few. I am gradually learning my species, but those are the main ones that I saw in quite large quantities. We've also got some annuals here. Some are, I believe some will come every year.
Why it's not working and I can't get it to work.
Are you all right? We've got a problem here. Okay. Right, I'll carry on, but tell me if you want me to stop. Wave at me, Viv, if you need me to stop. Okay, so annuals, there were some other annuals from the meadow that that Joseph gave us. The pansies, various vetches, and the yellow rattle. And we also did have some wild grasses. I don't know how much that wild grass we had originally and how much came from the Joseph's meadow, but we do have a variety of grasses. I can't recognise any of them. You'd need Tony for that. So this is late May, early June, in the very first year. Sorry, you can see it's a windy site. And we were absolutely mesmerised by this. It just blew us away. Absolutely beautiful. And the dogs thought so too. There were lots and lots of trails through it of a variety of animals, well, mainly rabbits and foxes, I think, but probably quite a lot of rodents of various sorts. You can see the cat's ear, the big tall yellow flower. You can see the yellow rattle, there's lots of it. Bit of red clover, and lots of oxeye daisies. Okay, sorry, there's a very noisy helicopter going overhead, so I apologise if there's a horrible noise in the background. Okay, so in 2020, we'd done this, we thought, yeah, great, we've done a lovely job. And then Michael came up to us again and said, I haven't been able to get rid of my seed this year, would you like to do a second patch? Of course we would. Right, so we did another patch. So we did probably about another third of an acre this time, a little bit easier. In the second year, the summer of 2021, so this is a year on, this is the very first patch we sowed. So as you can see, lots of oxeyes, but a lot of other flowers in the mix as well, if you look through. Lots of clover, cat's ear, yellow rattle you can see there. And you might be able to hear some of the birds and insects have gone quiet. And what I didn't film, I'm afraid, is that we had a swallow family on the cables, telephone cables next to us. And we used to spend most of our time watching the swallows backwards and forwards swooping over the meadow. It was stunning. Now, this is the patch that we sowed in the second year, but where I bought the cornfield annuals. Okay, so it's very pretty. So we've got the blue cornflower, we've got pink corn cockle, we've got some oxeye daisies, but also some chamomile, the sort of slightly daintier yellow and white flowers. It's very, very pretty, it's very attractive, but as Viv says, you'll only get this in disturbed ground, and an established wildflower meadow is not going to have that every year. Okay, so that's what we did. We were delighted with it. We thought, hey, you know, this is fabulous. What a good job we've done. Pat ourselves on the back, and it's lovely. Oops. Now, year 3, things looked a little bit different. Much to our surprise, we got some common spotted orchids growing. Now, we were led to believe that seeds took quite a long time to germinate. We hadn't put any plugs in. So we can only assume that the common orchid seed was already there and dormant in the soil, and that we'd actually given it the right environment in which to germinate and grow. And we had about a dozen orchids just in one patch. It's the area that's actually the least fertile. And so, yeah, that was quite exciting. We had quite a lot of kidney vetch. Again, that was something I hadn't consciously sown. And I know Martin would be pleased because that's is it the common blue butterfly that feeds off the kidney vetch. I'm sure Martin will tell us a bit later, correct me. But anyway, he was quite excited by this kidney vetch, this orange and yellow flower. So we've got plenty of that. Now, the slightly disappointing bit was that some of the other varieties of flowers did seem to fade a little bit in the area that we'd first planted, and we did have a rather predominance of oxeye daisies. But I'll talk about that in a minute. So that's what the meadows look like when they're flowering, but what about the rest of the year? In the spring, we made sure that the grass was as short as possible, so that the flowers had a chance to actually compete, and they weren't outcompeted by the agricultural grasses. I think my husband in the first spring, he actually put the lawnmower over the top, which then, of course, I cursed him because then I had to rake up all the grass cuttings to try and reduce any increase in fertility of the soil. You don't want a fertile soil. The less fertile, the easier it is for the wildflowers to actually take hold. In late summer, it just looks like a bit of a brown patch. So you can see lots of seed heads. There's a couple of cat's ear flowers still there. What I should have done, which in hindsight, I should have though taken a video with some sound, because this meadow is now just absolutely buzzing with crickets. So it's a real constant buzzing sound of crickets, and also almost constant in the late afternoon of the busy swallows, just backwards and forwards over this meadow. So it might not be a flower spectacle, but it's certainly alive, absolutely buzzing. And if you walk through it at this time of year, there's things just hopping everywhere. There's lots of moths of variety sort, mainly meadow brown, butterflies, but a few others as well. So these pictures were taken a couple of months ago. As you can see on the left, we have a nice weed patch. I have a little story about this. My parents are very traditional gardeners with their beautiful pristine lawns and their rose beds, etc. And last autumn she came round, and my dear mother, she means well, but she asked me, when was I going to spray the weeds, because we didn't have a weed problem. But here I am happily cultivating weeds. I'm actually actively encouraging them. So this is what we have had in October, and then on the right, we didn't actually cut it all. We did leave some long grass, mainly to provide a habitat for those creatures, that the rodents that tend to live in here, the field voles. And I'm sure Tony will tell me, but is it bank voles as well? And other mice would live in here. So we left some of it long, just to provide a little bit of habitat for them. We're fortunate enough to borrow some sheep. Now, why do I want sheep? In the winter, it was handy to keep the grass relatively short, to stop the competition, and it saved us cutting the meadow. In theory, these little cloven hooves can help break up the sward a little bit, the grass sward, and can help some of the seed actually get into the soil. That's the theory. On the right is Kenny. He's a pedigree Kerry Blue, and there's an ancient ewe called Eleanor. They were a funny pair, but they were very helpful, and they kept the grass short. Interestingly, they actually preferred eating the weed patch rather than the grass patch, and I thought that was quite an interesting observation. So they actively chose the flowers, not the grass. So again, sorry, to go back to my slide. So the first season, we let the flower seeds drop. We cut the meadows short very late in the late summer. We cleared away all the, and in the early spring, and we cleared away the cuttings. The second winter, we had sheep grazed on it, and we've actually got sheep on it again now. also dug up areas of really dense grass. This is because I just worried in the more fertile areas the grass was taking over. And I kept on digging up the thistles. Now, purists will probably tell me not to dig up the thistles. I'm sorry, I dig up the thistles. And I'd love people's comments on this. Now, I did add some more annual seed to areas of bare soil. Why? Because I like the pretty flowers. They're very colourful, these annuals. Did it work? No, it was a complete and utter waste of time. I got no annuals come through. Anyway, so I put the question mark on the benefits of selective weeding. I'd love to hear people's comments, especially because there was a lady who's got a 20-year-old meadow, I think, who was in the audience. I'd love to hear their comments. So what did I do after we planted the meadow? Well, I decided to plant a lavender border to demarcate the difference between the garden and the meadow. Naively thinking this was going to be a very easy thing to do, look pretty, smell great, and be covered in bees. What I didn't realise is this is actually great food for the rabbits, and I battled with this, and what you probably can just about see is there's netting all over it, as the rabbits kept on eating my lavender plants. This year it's a bit more successful. And yes, there's lots of bees on it. It's lovely, but it's a temperamental thing to do. Sorry, lavenders are temperamental, and I'm struggling with it. They didn't really like the total drought because I wouldn't water them this year. So we'll see whether it survives, but it seemed like a good idea at the time, and it's quite pretty. I've also planted a couple of clumps of trees. So the idea is to provide slightly different habitat, bit of shade, bit of shelter. Again, I'd love to hear comments from the group that have planted wildflowers around under saplings. So what you can see here, a couple of field maple, there's a spindle, there's a couple of hawthorn. You must understand this is a very, very windy, exposed spot, okay? Things are going to grow very slowly. I've got a rather pathetic looking wire mesh here because we have deer regularly coming through the garden. Only the other day I had a big fallow stag in the garden that was causing chaos. So that's the idea behind that is little copses of trees to provide a different sort of habitat. And actually we sowed some more. We're a bit glutton for punishment. We had hoped to sow some more in August when we knew we'd have seed available. But as you all know, the weather was so dry, it was so hot, the ground was like concrete. So we decided to wait until October when we thought the ground would be softer. It was a little bit softer, but it's still quite hard work. This is my poor husband. He's not here this evening, and it's probably a jolly good thing too, because he curses my enthusiasm about this meadow and how much work it's taken. I think he enjoys it. I think he likes the appearance, but he still curses me. Anyway, so I ended up having to lift the turf, and yeah, that was not much fun. So what do? Because I couldn't use the seed from our own meadow because the meadow seed had long dropped, I actually went and bought more seed. Yeah, expensive. Now, partly on advice and partly on, I'm going to blame Martin again on this. I bought flower seed with a supposedly much wider flowering season. So for different sort of varieties, different sort of mix, with the aim of trying to attract more butterflies and different species, because the predominant number of the flowers that I have, species I have from the Joseph's Meadow, flower really from middle of May through to end of July, beginning of August, because I collected seed in August. So that everything had already just gone to seed at that point. So I'm hoping that we will have a slightly different variety. These are some of the species. I haven't put all the different, I haven't put all these up because I haven't yet to learn most of these myself. Viper's bugloss, I think it's a blue flower. More species of knapweed, bird's foot trefoil, common toadflax, musk mallow, self-heal, betony, and devil's bit scabious. fantastic name. But I'm hoping that we'll attract different species of butterflies. So this is a picture of what we hope it's going to look like. We don't know if it will do. What I've also done is the bit of meadow that we planted in the first year, back in 2019. I've cut large, wide strips of turf through that as well. And I've sown this seed in those strips. So I'll be interested to see how much of these flowers take, how much they get crowded out by the existing flowers, and also, do they last? Will they just be there for one season? Will they be there for many seasons? I don't know. And what you do need to appreciate is nothing ever stays the same from year to year. So you could plant a meadow and it looks like one thing one year, but you must appreciate that nature will change. Things will look different the next year. There'll be competition, certain species won't cope, other species will take over. The climate will be different. So you have to expect a change and you expect the meadow to evolve. So there's no point in standing still. And if you remember that these meadows traditionally would have been very carefully managed for their livestock in the past, with fairly low density grazing. So they were managed, they weren't just left, these meadows. There was always human activity to create the opportunity for these meadows to thrive. Okay, I keep talking about Jane and Michael Joseph. It's a shame they're not here tonight. They really are an inspiration, these couple. If you ever get to see their meadow, and this is a video of their meadow, I would really encourage you to do. What you'll notice is this meadow, there's such a variety of flowers at different heights. The sward is so thick. There's very little grass. It's absolutely full of orchids, although you can't see them. The other interesting note is their meadow is actually in a much more fertile land than ours. It's quite a sheltered spot. I know it's a bit breezy here, but it's quite sheltered. It's quite different. So in a way, I'm surprised our meadows have done as well as it has with this seed, but it has. I had to thank Richard Groves for letting me use his video pictures. So do go and check those YouTube videos. Emma's Gate seeds, as I say, were really helpful, and do look them up. And there's Naturescape, that's the other company I used this year. Sorry. And then my final parting is to spread the seed. Again, this is where I wish I'd given you a video with sound, because you'll just hear at this point, it's not noise, it's the whole meadow is just buzzing, it's alive. It's not just a flower, a collection of flowers. You really get the feel that it's a habitat. It's somewhere where lots of creatures live. And this is why it's so exciting. And in the summer, I would drag all my neighbours around to come and sit and have a drink and watch the sun go down, because it really is such a spectacle. And anybody who's not even an ecologist or enthusiastic about the environment, people just go, wow, doesn't that look fantastic? And isn't that a nice thing to have? So spread the seed, and that's what we're hoping to do. Okay, that's me done.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah, for telling us your story. I'm sure everybody enjoyed hearing about it. Just to mention that I've put links to the Bold Explorer YouTube videos in the chat. You can copy them from the chat or save the chat at the end. And also suppliers that Sarah used, and also one from the Sussex Wildlife Trust that they suggest too. Before I move on to any questions and answers, I would just like to add a few words about the wildlife that supports the wildlife meadow support. A typical suite of meadow plants can provide for 1,400 invertebrate species. Wildflower areas include food plants and egg-laying habitat for the caterpillars that become butterflies and moths. A wildflower meadow provides seeds, nectar, pollen, and leaves as sources of food and life. Bees, bumblebees, wasps are attracted to the nectar and pollen. Insects such as ants are drawn to the flowers due to their sweet fragrance. Taller vegetation creates resting places for beneficial insects such as spiders, ladybirds, and lacewings. Meadows can provide a suitable habitat for things like grasshoppers, crickets, amphibians, and small mammals. Birds will eat the wildflower seeds and prey on the insects living there. Wildflower meadows are valuable habitats for nature, so we hope you will find somewhere in your gardens, verges, and community spaces to make a wildflower meadow area. I'm not sure we've actually got any questions in the chat yet, have we? Or
Oh, Martin,
oh yes, we have.
Martin corrected us. It's the small blue butterfly, and I gather it's not that common, but it likes the kidney vetch, so that's what's important. And it is quite a pretty butterfly. Yep.
Right. Yes, we do have a couple of questions. Right. So Clarissa says, "What is the best recommendation for a turf stripper, please? And what would your husband say about this?"
We hired one from a local plant hire company, and to be honest, it didn't work terribly well. It wasn't brilliant, but there's no way we're going to do that by hand. I think it's a bit hit and miss. I wouldn't go out and buy one. I have in the past tried to clear some by hand, and literally I could only do a few feet at a time. It's such hard work. So I think you need to just have a inquire at your local plant, your building machinery hire place.
Lovely.
But just add to that a little bit, Billy.
Yep.
One thing that some people have tried instead of a turf stripper is to actually scarify the ground very, very harshly. Especially if you've got low nutrient soils, you can actually, scratch the soil quite severely, and that might be enough to actually establish the wildflowers within that. So it is there are other methods, but actually the turf stripper is a particularly effective one if you've got the energy to do it.
I mean, I have seen up at the Slindon estate in the spring, one spring we walked past, or early spring, they had what looked like a really heavy sort of harrow. I think it wasn't a chain harrow, it was the other type of harrow, and they were going through what looked like a very short short grass meadow with it, and then another tractor was going around behind the seed. So I'd be interested to see how effective that was. It's on the side of the downs, so I presume it's not terribly fertile. So as you say, scarify the soil, so that might work. But
that sounds like that was a power harrow.
Yeah,
the thing you want to avoid doing is harrowing too deep, because then actually you might disturb some buried seeds, which are probably of weed species. So lots of options.
Lovely. Thank you. Right, so we have another message. Kira says they really enjoyed that, and they were wondering if you saw any benefits in the other parts of your garden since planting the wildflower meadow.
I think generally, I see a lot more insects and a lot more butterflies than before. Is that because I'm looking for them now, because I'm aware of them, or is that because we've encouraged more to come? I don't know. We've certainly had resident families of swallows, which appear to be quite successful. I know it was very, very dry this year, so I don't know if they all survived in the drought. We have a lot of owls, so I presume we get a lot more rodents in the meadow than we used to. My cat obviously can't eat them all. I've seen adders. I've found some little adders in my compost heaps and my grass heaps. As I say, it's difficult to know how much is that I'm noticing more and how much there genuinely is more wildlife, but I'm aware of more wildlife, yes.
I'm sure you're right. I'm sure there is much more wildlife there. If you think about those individual octopi daisy flowers and how many there were, it's a compound flower. It means it's not just one flower, it's a compound of lots of flowers in one head. And each one of those can support quite a lot of insects. Now, if you magnify that by the number of flowers there, you've got an enormous volume of insects. And also, I think it's very good you've left some areas uncut, because actually that's a wonderful refuge where you get even more insects than you would as a result.
I see Martin's offering to talk about yellow rattle.
I'll talk about yellow rattle for a few seconds. I mean, I was also a little worried about introducing it, partly because it doesn't just parasitize grasses, it also parasitizes legumes. And the most important legume you have in your meadow is birdsfoot trefoil. And anything that's going to possibly destroy that, I didn't like. But anyway, I decided to introduce it about 3 years ago, and basically I'm happy with it, because what it does, it thins the meadow, and certainly my garden butterflies much prefer it. So the thinner the meadow, and basically the shorter the meadow, the shorter the sward, the more butterflies that you will have, including kidney vetch, which has colonized my my meadow. The only thing about yellow rattle, which Sarah didn't mention, I don't think, is that if you have an established meadow and you want to introduce it, you must scarify the ground, because it won't germinate unless it's on bare soil. So you have to do something that Tony mentioned, really. You have to really be hard on the ground and cut into the turf, so that you have bare patches. Because if you just for instance, if you were to sprinkle some yellow rattle on an ordinary lawn, none of it will germinate. So you have to have little bare patches. When I say bare patches, I mean a square centimetre. I don't mean, you know, so a square foot. I just mean little bits where the seed can germinate. So yeah, yellow rattle gets my vote for approval.
Lovely, thanks for that, Martin. Moving on, Mark has said, why is it a bit late for yellow rattle now? Surely we have a lot of frost ahead.
Well,
I better put Martin back on. And
yeah, you can do. I mean, there are things you can do to kind of trick nature, even though the seeds might have set. If you can get the yellow rattle seeds, and get all that work done before the frosts, then you technically can do it. The other thing you can do in order to try and cheat nature is put the seeds in the freezer and then sow them all the wrong time. I tend to go with the way it would work naturally first, but you can always, you know, try things and actually trick nature to come out to actually vernalize the plant when you need to.
I totally agree with Tony. Follow nature, because nature always knows best. But I think Mark's question is very valid, and I suspect that if you collected yellow rattle seed in late summer and you had it in your cupboard and you now used it in November, I think it would set very nicely. I think the important thing is don't sprinkle it around in the spring. That's the important message. So preferably when it naturally drops, but if you can't do that, then any time in the autumn, I'm sure will be fine.
Well, yes, I was just typing a response to that. I mean, surely when the yellow rattle seed is naturally being produced in the early summer or midsummer, the sward of vegetation around it is thick. There's no question that the seed can't reach the ground. And you said earlier that yellow rattle won't grow if it's just thrown onto the grass, but that's what happens naturally.
It's a numbers game, basically. I think in when the natural system gets established, yellow rattle produces a lot of seed, so some of it manages to get away. And also, if you think about it, when yellow rattle is established, it's reducing the vigor of the grass. So when it dies down, there's more gaps in the canopy. So the problem is, if you try to introduce yellow rattle into a very dense grass sward, that's when it can't get going. Once it makes its own gaps in the grass canopy, it can set seed for itself, and it's a numbers game, so there are lots of seed, and it starts to adapt to the site.
You may also argue the point about using the sheep, because the hooves, the little cloven hooves, do make lots of little dents in the ground. It wasn't enough to make for annual seed to germinate in it. Sorry, the cornfield annual seed, but perhaps it's enough for the yellow rattle. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right. I mean, it's evolved for that sort of habitat, whereas the cornfield annuals have evolved for bigger areas of cultivated soil, whereas this needs gaps in the canopy to be able to establish.
So the next comment is from Phil and Kim, and they say, probably like some of your attendees tonight, we don't have a meadow, only a small lawn. Would your approach work on this? Sarah, would you like to say something on that?
I don't see why not. You might not need a turf cutter. You might be able to dig it by hand. but you don't want to dig. You don't want to dig too deep. You don't want to disturb the structure of the soil as much. You're just trying to take the turf off. You might find that grass encroaches on it quite quickly. So you might find you have to work at the edge between the lawn and your little strip, just to keep at it each year to stop the invasion by the grass. I think it also depends on the soil type and the position, because don't forget, we're on a very exposed, dry spot. So if you're in a shady area or you're in a damp area, you'll probably need advice about what sort of seeds to use. The sort of seeds that we use is used to the really bare exposed areas, so well-draining areas. So you might need to adapt according to what sort of environment you have. But I don't see why a little patch, a little bed, or just a strip around the edge, I mean, that surely is going to be much more valuable than a bare lawn. And also the Josephs, that they're real purists, that they let things germinate in their lawn. They've got their lawns invaded by a whole variety of flowers. Michael mows little bits, or doesn't bother mowing it at all for a few weeks in the spring, and he just lets them grow. So that's another option as well.
Yeah, so I could just add that. I mean, I completely agree. It works very well on a small scale, and to some extent you've got more control. But the other thought about that is that if you're introducing this onto a lawn, most people's lawns are actually already fairly nutrient poor, because most people just mow lawns and take the cuttings away. If you do that for year after year after year, you're reducing the fertility. If you have a little patch in the middle of that, which you actually treat as a hay meadow, it may even spread a bit. You're kind of shifting the competitive advantage a little bit towards some of the flowers that might do well. So you may find that it'll actually spread. And I really like the idea of starting small.
Lovely, thank you, Tony. Clarissa's just made a comment. Could I use a turf stripper now in the winter? Is that one for Tony, perhaps?
It's okay. I mean, you could use one now. It's back to when's the best time to actually set seed rather than when's the best time to do the turf stripping. Because actually the best time to set seed is the time when it would naturally fall from the plant. I think Sarah alluded to earlier. So if you see the seeds are forming and setting, starting to fall to the ground, that's the best time to sow them, which actually is kind of autumn. And the biggest problem you'll have by doing that, by doing the turf stripping now, is that yellow rattle, that actually needs to overwinter. It needs to be set in autumn. It needs to be spread on the ground in autumn so it can suffer a frost before it will actually germinate the next year. Hay rattle, the yellow rattle, is an exception to the rule. You know, we said that all the meadow plants were perennials, whereas the weeds are annuals. Yellow rattle is an annual. So it needs to set seed every year. Which is unusual for that sort of habitat. So it needs to be able to set seed, and it needs to be vernalized or made cold over winter. So that you could do the turf stripping now, but you've actually missed that window more or less for actually sowing some of the seed.
Having said that, we've planted stuff in October this year.
Yeah.
So because it was far too dry and hot. So I can report back next year and see whether it's worked or not. I think there's no hard and fast rules, I reckon. I think it's experiment, and sometimes you're lucky and sometimes you're not.
Lovely. Madeline has made a comment, said targeted weeding.
Yes, thank you very much, Sarah. That was absolutely delightful. My gosh, you've given yourself a big job. We did it much more slowly. We inherited 1.5 hectare meadow, which had been cropped by a small number of sheep for some years, but it had never, as far as I know, been subject to any chemicals. So we simply got our neighbouring farmer to cut it and bale it and take it away, and really quite surprisingly quickly things came back, and it was wonderful. We also had a visit from a chap called Mike Mullis, who was a great wildflower expert, and he threw a bit of fairy dust around, which included some orchids. And when I've sadly left this meadow now, but by the time I left, there were over 250 of these gorgeous orchids you can see behind me. But there are inevitably a couple of thugs. And in our case, it was hairy tear and corky fruited water dropwort. And in those cases, yes, I did remove them. I mean, you could never remove all of them, but I did pull out a certain amount.
Lovely, thank you.
Martin, did you want to join in the discussion of the selective weeding?
Yes, if I may. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, I selectively weed. Are you hearing me, Julie?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, yeah. I selectively weed. I mean, when I first established the Wildflower Meadow in 2005, I had far too many oxeye daisies, so I dug a lot out. I also had far too many wild carrots, and I dug a lot of those out as well. And in recent years, I certainly will remove ribwort plantain, oxeye daisy, common yarrow, and dandelions. It's not because I dislike these plants, it's because I prefer other ones to be in their place. So this last autumn, I must have dug out 200 ribwort plantains with pleasure. So some gardens, particularly mine anyway, will quickly become dominated by just 2 or 3 wildflowers, and unless you want that, you have to do something about it. So I'm all in favour of selective weeding, but it's hard work. It's hard work, and if you do it, do it after sustained rain, so at least you can dig them out easily, because otherwise it's jolly hard work.
To some extent, you're copying what happens in nature anyway. When you went back to the sheep, they were selecting what they ate, and you find that happens quite often. And when damage happens or disturbance happens to a meadow, it may affect some species more than others. So, I don't think it. I think fiddling about by actually doing some selective weeding and maybe putting in some local disturbance patches, I think it's a really good idea. And you're actually creating variety in an area and breaking what could end up as single species dominance. This is the point about if a site is too fertile, what happens is you'll get one species that's a bit of a thug taking over from everything else. And that's why you need to get the nutrients out if you can. And then if there's very few nutrients, then no one plant can dominate. And that's then you've broken the kind of dominance.
I'll move on. Just Kira has asked any books that were helpful.
I don't know any offhand. It's funny, isn't it? Because you're thinking about it. I ought to have had a list of them in my head, but I can't think of any at the moment. I'll have to think about that and see if we can put some on a website or something.
I have a very ancient edition of a Collins wildflower guide that my grandfather gave me, and that's what I go around and trying to learn. But the actual making of the meadow, no, we had the advice from the Josephs, advice from the Emma's Gate, and of course Viv and Tony down the road. So no is the answer.
Goodness.
There may be a new naturalist series on meadows generally, but I don't know whether that includes actually how to make them. And I think Sarah's right. It's something that it's probably fairly recent if it has been written about. 10 years ago, we were telling everybody you can never recreate a lovely meadow. But then the systems were developed and we can. Any other questions? Any other discussion? How many people here are actually have tried to establish a meadow? Just looking around. I think there were a few, yes, and Mark has, and I know Martin has. Yeah.
Just as interest, the group from Bexhill, what sort of flowers have you sown under your saplings, and what sort of soil have you got for it?
It's a good question. While you're looking for that, I'll have a bit of a thought, because hay meadows are generally very open and very sunny. I mean, most of the plants require these very open areas. So when you have trees and shade, it's a different sort of habitat. And the sort of mixtures you tend to go for might be woodland edge or woodland glade species that would be rather different. I think of something like a red campion, for example, and some of the woodland plants that you might associate with openings in woodland rather than wildflower meadows. And of course, these things all mix up depending on just how open or shady it is. So when you get some other intricacies, it gets very interesting. What do you do when it's a bit shaded? What do you do when it's a bit wet? What do you do when it's very wet? What you do on chalk is going to be different to what you do on sand. So that's when it all starts to get very exciting.
No, I was just saying that we had established a wildflower patch in a piece of common land. We're all round a green, and we did it there, and it just changes every year. Okay, so at first there was a lot of yellow rattle. This year we got wild carrot, didn't we?
Yeah, a lot of wild carrot.
Because it got very dry, and we did it all by scarifying and not by removing the turf. So it's just a matter of just keeping an eye on it. It's not a very big patch. So there you go. That's how we did it, by scarifying. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I think there was another person who put a hand up. Was it Mark? Yes, yes.
Well, there's a couple of points. If you look at a Wildlife Trust's list of reserves, we've often got a few meadows, and plant life has been helping to foster meadows, magical meadows. So there's a way to go and see other meadows and how they're going. And secondly, now we can escape slightly. Some of the wonderful meadows I've seen have been in France, with over 200 species in them, and in Romania, where they don't have walls or fences, they just have grasslands full of plants, and northern Spain, where I've seen little pocket fields, hardly bigger than my hand, where they're just full of yellow rattle, and they harvest them in little wooden carts. So there's other places to go, even if we look after ours and lost 97.
And there's some good places in Britain to go and see some kind of more commercial areas. Sissinghurst, I think, over in East Sussex is very good, and there's some other wildflower meadows. I think Beauty's frozen. Is her broadband broken down?
Oh, maybe that's
We've done very well so far, so that's rather good.
absolutely. Hello, Julie. Are you still there? Oh, I wonder if she's been kicked out. Fiona Mills says, thank you, fascinating and motivating to do more, especially as the grass was so poor this summer in the drought. We might as well grow weeds on my sandy hill and try wildflowers.
Yeah.
Definitely, Fiona. We shall, if you need any support or anything, then, Julie and I'm sure Sarah and everyone will be, very pleased to create some more wildflower meadows in the area. And I think, if I remember correctly, you might be in the Cold Waltham area, so not a million miles away anyway. So, yeah, that's great. I've got a message here, which is actually came directly to me, which says from Fran's iPad. She says, thank you. I shall try sowing some yellow rattle soon. So looks like we are having an effect on people's attitudes and actions, which is super. Right. I have Rosie here saying, do you have any particular tips for encouraging orchids in wildflower meadows? I think that one's for you, Sarah.
Okay, the orchids appeared on their own. We didn't plant them. I don't know whether we had any orchid seed from the Joseph's Meadow. However, I doubt it. The area where the orchids grew this year was the most exposed and and the driest bit with the poorest grass. So my feeling is that the seed was there already, and we gave it the right environment to grow and germinate. I could be wrong. So perhaps we need to concentrate on giving it the right habitat, the right to grow in, the right conditions. Otherwise, I had been tempted to go and buy orchid plugs, and I was considering doing it, and I missed the boat the last year. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to let them carry on. So I think it's all down to conditions. Tony might correct me on that one.
No, I agree, and I think they must have already been there. I think orchids take several years before they actually flower. So they're probably there not just as seed, but actually as corms, like little bulbs under the soil. So I was very surprised to see them after a couple of years. I mean, maybe they germinated that quickly, but it seems strange. When it comes to trying to design the right conditions, I'm not really sure. You may know that orchids produce incredibly small seeds, which are more like spores. They're so small, but there are millions of them. They go everywhere. The thing with orchids is they need just the right conditions, and they also have an association with the right sort of fungus. They have to find that or carry it with them in order to be able to germinate and grow. So there's all sorts of mixtures of conditions that need to be right in order to get orchids. So planting orchid seeds, I think, is quite risky. I think it's very unlikely to be successful. Putting in plugs, that might work, but I think Sarah's right. You just make the right conditions, build it and they'll come kind of approach, and just appreciate them if they do arrive. Same thing happened to me on our lawn here. I decided not to mow the lawn for a few years, and a common spotted orchid in the middle. We've now got about a dozen, where we used to have just one. It's just gradually built up. But yes, it's very difficult to say exactly what you need to do to get orchids. Just manage the habitat in the right sort of way and see what comes.
On the same topic, but slightly off the point, I was in a traffic jam on the A27 going from Brighton towards Shoreham back in the summer, and as I was in the traffic jam waiting to go past towards the Lancing, I noticed in the central reservation beside me, it was absolutely full of orchids. Is it because they weren't cut, the council stopped cutting the grass? I don't know, but it was absolutely chock-a-block full of orchids. I was trying to get my passenger to take photos as I was not concentrating in the traffic queue, but it was amazing.
I've just joined. I'm back. Sorry about that, everybody.
Excellent, Julie. Well, we were just talking about orchids, so I'll give you a little while just to kind of get back in the swing of things. But I think maybe, Clarissa, you might want to just say, what you've said in the chat is in Plastow, Chiddingfold area, we are growing selected food plants for the wood white butterfly. And you've given us a link, but I was wondering whether you might want to say a few words about that as well, actually, whilst we have you on screen, perhaps.
Okay, Viv, yes. So in the villages around us, they've worked out it's one of the last populations of the wood white. And so we've had volunteers coming into various people's gardens, and working together to strip a few bits of soil. And actually, I think, we did have seed, but there's also been some plug plants that have been given to us. I'm not sure how successful it's been. It's only, I think we're sort of year 2. I haven't actually found out how it's gone, but we had a strip in our garden, and as Sarah was saying, it was absolutely magical, just having very few flowers that came up, just to see the insects that arrived in what was otherwise a very barren area. And I sort of put a little chair right in the middle of there, often sat out there with my cup of tea and literally watched a few bees and things which weren't normally there. But it was fantastic. So, it's lovely to hear what Sarah's done, and love to try and do a bit more. But I think this project's going on for a good few years, and as I say, I don't know the results yet.
Excellent. Well done, Clarissa. We'll come and see it one day, actually, because we haven't been to yours yet.
Yeah, I do.
Mark, I know you are attempting a wildflower meadow. Maybe I've kind of lost track a little bit, maybe a year or two now, actually. But I see you've recommended in the chat that the book Making a Wildflower Meadow by Pam Lewis. Do you want to give us a few words on that, or does anybody else know this book perhaps? And then I think I might just hand over back to Julie again.
Yes, there is a book. I read it. It was quite interesting. It gives a few tips. I can't remember if there's anything in there that we haven't covered already. I mean, I've been doing a meadow about the same time scale as you, Sarah. I didn't strip the turf. felt like too much hard work, but I did harrow it quite hard with a tractor, and sowed some seed from Emmersgate. I've got quite a lot of seed, quite a lot of yellow rattle seed, and a heavy clays mix. And it's doing reasonably. I don't think it's looking as good as yours, though. I think you're better off doing the stripping. Maybe I should do that.
Well, Madeline's suggesting, yes, the Wildflower Lawns and Meadows.com has a lot of help on how to start a meadow and sow things and maintain it. So yeah, there's quite a lot of information on their website.
I mean, more information is both on the Emmersgate and the Naturescape sites. They've got lots of information, and as I say, in my experiences, their feedback has been really, really useful. I've plugged them with questions, and they've been really useful. So yeah, again, if you've got different habitats, I would go and contact them before you try and sow anything.
Yeah, they do mixtures for different sorts of habitats, and they're quite nicely described as well. So it's quite an education to go through the Emmersgate catalogue and kind of match it up to the conditions you think you've got.
Kay is saying my garden has shady areas. I think the comment might have got cut off actually. I don't know if I can bring Kay in. Let's see. No, I can't do that. I'm not quite sure.
Okay, I've seen the rest of her comment in the comments box in the chat, and yes, it's about what sort of woodland plants might you use. I mentioned I always think that shock of colour you get from red campion is very nice. Other things, perhaps some of the larger ones like cow parsley is quite good, or hedge parsley. They're very, very rich in insects as well. What else can you have? It's like primroses or cowslips, depending on just how open and how deep the soil is. There is a hedgerow mix and I think a woodland edge mix. Maybe it's the same thing in the Emmersgate catalogue. And I think that actually gives a nice mixture of woodland edge type plants. There are probably others I just can't think of any at the moment. Any plants. Lettuce celandine, somebody said. And wood anemone. Wood anemone is very slow to colonise, so it won't come there naturally. But if you did put it in, that would be a lovely plant to have. And bluebells, yes. Not Spanish ones, though, obviously.
Right, lovely. I think we're getting towards the end of our time now, so I'll hand back to Vivian to close. Over to you, Vivian.
Well, thanks, Julie. Thanks ever so much for that. Well, I hope you found this talk interesting and all the discussions afterwards. And we've deliberately left time to be able to discuss and to actually just get people's interest. So, you know, the main aim for us is not really just to, shall we say, have a lovely evening's entertainment, but it is really important to us to make sure that people really go home and actually try and find more places where we can create patches of wildflower rich meadows. And, you know, obviously we've discussed this can be very small patches in your own garden, maybe road verges, green spaces in town, which you can influence the parish councils, or in fact, anywhere suitable. So we've heard from Julie how this, well, and everybody really, how this will improve life for our insects in peril and other wildlife moving through these habitats. And, you know, making these habitats more favorable for a number of species and not just insects, not just invertebrates, but virtually for everything and everybody going through. And on top of that, of course, wildflower meadows are so beautiful. And we've alluded to the aspects of the beauty and the sheer joy and pleasure we get from sitting in a wildflower meadow. And in fact, when Sarah invites us to her wildflower meadow in the summer months, it is really just beautiful sitting there and watching the sun go down, as I think one of her pictures so beautifully captured. So it remains for me to say a very special thanks to Sarah, our advocate in Wildflower Meadows, and of course, definitely also to Julie and for Tony to be roped in and to join us in the facilitation of this discussions. And everybody else, Martin in particular, but everybody else who has taken part, thank you ever so much. And good night, I guess, really.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah.
That's all right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you and good night.
Good night.
Good night.